Hey, welcome back, everyone. So some big stories to go into. I want to give some updates on what's happening with the Taliban right now and their, new takeover of Afghanistan, the U.S. withdrawal from there, what's happening at the airport, and also the Taliban's threat against the United States, or warning, I should say, that the United States needs to get its military out of the country by September 11th. Now, we'll go into what this means, what they're saying. A lot more on that. Also, how the Chinese Communist Party is using this whole thing. The Chinese Communist Party is declaring that America was defeated, and they're also making diplomatic ties with the Taliban, which is actually going to have, I would say, probably the biggest impact on the future of Afghanistan and of the Taliban if the Chinese Communist Party can align themselves with them, which they already are. We'll go into this, a lot of other stories. And folks, that said, it's great to see you all here. Yeah. Tumblers said, hi, Josh. Good seeing you. Thank you. Grace Asher, I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, Nikki Bobby said, China always involved. It does seem to be the case, right? Anywhere there's like crime or people, corrupt politicians or anything like that, it always seems the CCP isn't far behind, right? Jenny Alicia, you said, good evening, Josh. Thank you. Yeah, folks, you're all great. That said, I want to, before we get started, just mention that we are still demonetized by YouTube. Again, YouTube's not really giving us a straight answer on why they're demonetizing our channel. We recently got a note back from them trying to get our monetization back. They said that, it's indefinite. We're not getting ads back. And they said it's a channel within our network or a channel connected to one of our accounts violated their community policy or standards. They're not telling us what happened or anything like that. So here we are, but luckily, again, we do have Epoch TV, EpochTVcom. And if you want to support Crossroads, be sure to check out Epoch TV. I want to show you a quick trailer of what we're working on right now. Again, we're making this communism history series, special series. First episode is already out. Second episode is coming out very soon. It's going to be this week. So, folks, that said, we'll show you a quick trailer, then we'll jump into the stories. Communism is a belief in the destruction of belief. It destroys religion wherever it goes. So who is the unholy father of communism? François-Noël Gracchus-Babeuf. The French Revolution would be remembered for its unjust bloodshed, killing over 300,000 people. It was a period known as the Reign of Terror. All right, again, that's part 2 of the History of Communism series we're doing, talking about the French Revolution, the Jacobins, the Cercle Social, the Cult of Reason. A lot of you probably not many people know about the Cult of Reason, which was the movement they established under the parties against Robespierre and all these guys. Interesting history that nobody talks about, which has a very clear lineage to communism through François-Noël Gracchus-Babeuf, up through the League of Outlaws, the League of the Just, into the communist leagues. We're going to be explaining this whole history, a lot of stuff that, they don't teach you in school, let's put it that way. And again, folks, second episode's coming out soon. Again, August 21st, pretty soon. First episode is already out. If you haven't seen it yet, be sure to go to Epoch TV, EpochTVcom. And again, if you don't have an Epoch TV account, all you need for a free trial is your email address. So check it out. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the first story for the night. I want to talk about what's happening in Afghanistan. Now, it says here, Taliban warning, U.S. must fully withdraw American troops by September 11th. This is what they're saying. It says here, a spokesman for the Taliban, and I should note that while Trump is banned off Twitter, the Taliban main spokesman is currently on Twitter. It says a spokesman for the Taliban warned that U.S. troops in Afghanistan have to leave by September 11th, the anniversary of the terrorist attacks that launched the United States into the war, after troops were redeployed to the Kabul capital to oversee an evacuation. Sahul Shaheen, a member of the Taliban's political office, told Sky News on Tuesday that, quote, we are committed not to attack them, talking about the U.S. troops. Again, the Biden administration has deployed 6,000 U.S. troops to assist in the withdrawals from the country, as not only U.S. citizens are there, U.S. diplomats are there, but also a lot of Afghan folks who've assisted the U.S. over the years trying to escape. Now, he said, we are committed not to attack them, but he stressed they have to leave by that date. In other words, the U.S. troops have to leave by September 11th. They're not saying exactly what's going to happen. Again, it's not clear what will happen if American troops remain in Afghanistan after September 11th. They're not stipulating this. The United States had previously planned to withdraw its troops by the end of August, but the Pentagon was forced to send thousands of soldiers, again 6,000, to the country to facilitate evacuations from Kabul, which was quickly captured by the Taliban, considered a terrorist group by many countries on Sunday. Now, that said, briefly, there's around 11,000 Americans remaining in Afghanistan, according to the White House. The White House initially put the number lower. Now they're saying 11,000 who identify as American, and up to, the numbers are all over the place, 5,000, 10,000 who are actually Americans. It's not clear. But there are, at that point, thousands of Americans still in the country. Also, as U.S. troops are trying to evacuate people they were being shot at, according to some reports, U.S. troops have been shot at and returned fire as well at the Kabul airport and armed individuals and killed armed individuals. It's not clear whether those were Taliban fighters or other folks. That said, currently the Taliban is, rounding up firearms of the local population. Not a sign that they're going to become a peaceful party by any means, I would assume, because, guess what? They're not getting rid of their guns. They're making sure that other people don't have guns. And if that sounds like a common trend with the totalitarian regimes, going back to Nazi Germany during the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic had gun registration laws. The Nazis used the gun registration files to find everybody who had guns and seize their firearms. And what happened in Germany? Well, you tell me, folks. Same thing happened in many other countries. Under every totalitarian government, typically one of the first steps is to seize people's firearms while keeping their own, because it's, again, not about getting rid of guns. It's about making sure the people opposed to them are not able to have guns. And currently the Taliban is working on doing that. Now, the Biden administration has previously said, we went over it in the last episode, that if American troops are fired at, that they would retaliate. It's not clear whether this would constitute a reason to full-on retaliate, or if, again, this is just locals causing trouble, or people who maybe lost loved ones during the war, just trying to take it out on them as they're trying to flee. It's really not clear what's going on right now. You do have many Afghans on the tarmac trying to flee the country. There have been very large cargo planes, AC-130s, loading people up in the back and actually taking them to safety, we assume. The United States is working on also resettling a lot of these individuals who are trying to flee the country right now. Now, there's a lot going on with this that I want to go into, especially as it relates to China and their strategy for Afghanistan, because it's interesting the CCP was engaging with them prior to their recent takeover of the country. Now, technically, the U.S. could have stopped this from happening. Technically, we could have launched airstrikes against their large movements, which were, very much out in the open, much like we could have stopped ISIS from launching their complete terror over a lot of this region. Because, again, they were driving on roads, one car after the next, these huge caravans of vehicles, and not exactly a difficult target had we wanted to do that. Remember when Trump was still president and he found intel about these underground tunnels and the different terrorist groups using them? Remember what he did? He dropped a MOAB on them, which is the second largest missile, allegedly, next to a nuclear missile that the U.S. has, and made sure that they did not cause any further trouble. Now, we have many more MOABs, but they were not used in the current incident as, again, armed terrorists were riding into these cities to kill and, take child brides and so on. And lo and behold, here we are. But we'll be going into what's happening with this as well, because China is, again, doing a lot right now. And really, China's influence with this is going to very likely steer a lot of what's happening in Afghanistan. Now, before we say that, folks, it's going to mention real quick, again, we are totally demonetized, but luckily we do have sponsors. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Secure. And folks, you have to make sure you do everything you can to protect your privacy online when emailing and messaging, because, again, you don't really have privacy. Everything you do online, whether you're sending emails, anything like that, is typically scanned and monitored. Your data is under the magnifying glass of big tech, if not big government as well. Now, however, there's a way you can have legitimate privacy online by first sending emails and messages. It's a new privacy and cybersecurity platform called Secure. That's Secur. Secure offers private and secure instant messaging and email, and its servers and data centers are hosted in Switzerland. And why Switzerland? It's because Switzerland has the strictest data privacy laws in the world. Secure also uses proprietary encryption technology and an independent platform, which means it's not subject to the Intrusive Cloud Act, which any U.S. technology is notably held to, meaning that no matter how secure the platform is, if the federal government wanted to view your emails or so on, they'd have to give them to them. Now, with this said, Secure also does not mine your data. Using Secure, you can easily communicate with people who have the app and also those who do not have the app. You can also set a timer that will automatically destruct your messages or emails after you send them. Secure also uses technology that lets you communicate without fear that your internet provider will monitor your emails or messages, and you don't need a VPN to do that. To get Secure, it's only $5 for the messenger and $10 for the email and messenger package. You can take back your freedom and your privacy. Visit secure.com, Sekur.com today, and you can use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. And big thanks out to Secure for sponsoring tonight's episode. Now, folks, that said, I want to talk about what's happening with the Taliban and the Chinese Communist Party. Birds of a feather, it seems, flocking together. Let's go into what's happening. It says here, Chinese state media welcomes Taliban's rise in Afghanistan, exalts U.S. defeat. And this is important when it comes to their position. Let's explain it. It says here, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan gave the Chinese regime a golden opportunity to attack the United States and deepen its own influence. And here we're talking about specifically ideological attacks. It wasted no time to seize it. State-run newspapers, broadcasters, and Chinese diplomats have launched a propaganda offensive, not dissimilar to the regime's ongoing efforts to deflect blame around the origins of the pandemic, which they still blame on the U.S. military, claiming America brought it to the country. The propaganda includes touting the prospective Chinese friendship with the Taliban insurgents, something that wouldn't be unusual to the CCP given their close relations with the Iranian regime, which is, again, the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And again, the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan at a sweeping pace in the past week, mocking the U.S. defeat, Chinese Communist Party, and is also threatening Taiwan by questioning U.S. commitment to the Asia region. In other words, they're telling Taiwan, which is, again, under threat of Communist Party takeover from China. Taiwan's, again, a self-governing nation, which used to be considered the government in exile of China. The Chinese Communist Party was considered the, basically, thieves of the country. But again, Kuomintang fled to the island of Formosa, established Taiwanese system. And again, the Chinese Communist Party claims ownership over it. Now, the CCP has been threatening Taiwan, threatening to forcefully take over the country, sending in troops is the big concern. The U.S. is not really making a clear statement on whether they would defend Taiwan, although Japan is starting to step up to the plate. But the Chinese Communist Party is using the, failure of the U.S. to protect the Afghan people after having been there for so long, and saying, well, look what happened to the Afghanistan. You could be next, essentially. The U.S. has been helping you all this time, but when it comes down to it, maybe they won't help you. That's what they're trying to say. Now, put together, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing right now by the communist regime is this. They're saying the United States has failed Afghanistan and Beijing is ready to offer an olive branch. For the CCP, this is a strategic opportunity. And this is a quote here, as according to Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying in an August 17 press briefing. This is a CCP spokesman. He says, wherever the U.S. sets foot, be it Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan, we see turbulence, division, broken families, deaths, and other scars in the mess it has left. The U.S. power and role is destructive rather than constructive. Again, the Chinese Communist Party's foreign ministry spokesperson. Now, she told reporters a day prior that the changes in Afghanistan were a result of the, quote, will and choice of the Afghan people. They assume The Taliban is representative of the will and choice of the Afghan people, much like they claim the Chinese Communist Party is part of the will of the Chinese people, which you ask many Chinese, that's not the case. In late July, about a month before the scheduled U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Chinese regime was among the first countries to signal its support for the Islamist militants when Foreign Minister Wang Yi hosted a delegation of Taliban representatives in the port city of Tianjin. Big question there is what the Chinese Communist Party was saying to the Taliban representatives. Again, as the U.S. was withdrawing, maybe they encouraged them to do what they just did. It's unclear. Now, I want to go into a few points on this, and then I want to go deeper into it. A few points on this real quick. The Russian embassy right now is claiming the Afghan president fled with cars and a helicopter full of money. The allegation is that, well, the Afghan president had 3 cars full of money and a helicopter that they tried stuffing with money, couldn't fit all the money in, and left some on the landing pad. And this is according to the report that from the Russian embassy staff in Kabul, so take it for what it's worth. But this is playing into the narrative with this. Now, let's look at the broader picture, what's happening in Afghanistan. Basically, the United States was engaged in this long war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The U.S. had committed to really ending the insurgency emerging from Al-Qaeda, which, again, the Taliban had ties to. Taliban was more of a local terror threat, regional terror threat, although, again, their ties to Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was there for a bit, we assume, before he went to Pakistan. And again, the rise of ISIS caused a lot more trouble with that because many people who were loyal to Al-Qaeda and to these movements then sided with ISIS, and so they've been more deeply radicalized. The problem we have is this. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has close, very close diplomatic ties both with Iran and with the Pakistani government. One of the main tribal groups aligned with the Taliban is the Pashtun. The Pashtun also go across the Pakistan border, which is, again, where bin Laden was. And again, one of the problems the U.S. had fighting this long war in Afghanistan is many of the fighters were coming across the border from Pakistan, which the Chinese Communist Party had heavy control over. While the U.S. and allied countries were fighting in Afghanistan, the Chinese Communist Party was there, mining resources, doing other operations like that, and developing close diplomatic ties with some of these key people. The CCP did not get involved in war fighting, even though they were technically one of the friendly nations there helping with the, quote-unquote conflict, right? The CCP during that time was also developing a lot of other ties. According to earlier reports, and unfortunately I couldn't find it in time for this broadcast, the Chinese Communist Party, some of its agents by their own admission, said they were, quote, trying to keep the U.S. busy in Afghanistan. Some later reports, one we mentioned just recently on the broadcast, well, a couple months ago now, was one of these top-level CCP advisors stating that one of the goals of the CCP in terms of strategic agenda was to get the United States and keep the United States involved in multiple conflicts. They said 4 conflicts, of which was the war in Afghanistan. As I mentioned in the recent episode, one of my big concerns was that as the U.S. is sending 6,000 troops to assist in the withdrawals, that again, the CCP would have its interest to make sure that there's some kind of conflict that takes place that could draw the U.S. back into the Afghan conflict. Again, as a distraction mechanism. But based on the CCP's current positioning with this, actually my assessment has changed a bit. We'll see what happens still. You do have some small fire taking place at the airport. Again, U.S. troops have allegedly killed some people who had guns, who were firing at people on the tarmac. But we're not really getting much information out of this. It doesn't seem to be escalating further than that. The Taliban spokesman, people there, are claiming they're going to basically let the U.S. do the evacuations. They're not going to intervene. Unclear exactly what's going to happen with this. But my assessment right now, take it for what it's worth, this is just my assessment. My assessment is that the Chinese Communist Party is recognizing Afghanistan as a very key propaganda point. Because if the Chinese Communist Party can step in and implement its China model, this is basically a contest of systems. The CCP can step in, work with the Taliban, rather than try to work with the free people of Afghanistan, work with the Taliban and establish a totalitarian system there, much like its own, export the China model. And from there, if they can bring, peace and stability, quote unquote, to the region, then the CCP can go around parading that and say, look how effective we are. We succeeded where the U.S. failed, bringing stability to Afghanistan. One of the big problems you have is that stability by the Chinese statements is not stability with freedom. It's stability under totalitarian rule. And right now, the Taliban does appear to be following this structure. The Taliban is seizing people's firearms. The Taliban's, playing the cool game. They're claiming they're going to keep women's rights to some extent, letting women have jobs, letting women go to school. They're claiming, again, that they don't want conflict. They're claiming they're going to make sure terrorists aren't active in the country, even though the terrorists are running the country. They're seizing people's firearms, saying the fighting is over, again, time to stop. And they're siding with the Chinese Communist Party, which is going to be financing, they're already positioning to do so, some large infrastructure projects in Afghanistan, meaning that really Afghanistan is probably going to become a pet project of the Chinese Communist Party. There are some other important points with this, though. Let's go into it. Real quick, too, folks, we're on the halfway point. I'll go into some questions. So if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. Let's go into what's happening real quick, though, with some of these other details, because they're important when we look at it. Now, the United Nations right now is stating, this is according to one of the UN chiefs, they said, we must unite and fight global terrorist threats in Afghanistan. It says here, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on the world for unity and to fight the global terrorist threat in Afghanistan as Taliban insurgents took control of the nation's capital over the weekend. Guterres appealed to the UN Security Council and the international community to work together and ensure that human rights are upheld in the war-torn nation and make sure that Afghanistan never becomes a platform for terrorism again. The Portuguese national, again, who served as chief of the UN since 2017, said, we must unite to make sure Afghanistan is never again used as a safe haven for terrorists. He said this during an emergency meeting on Monday, and he also said, I appeal to the Security Council and the international community as a whole to stand together, to work together and act together and use all tools at its disposal to suppress the global terrorist threat in Afghanistan. Now, the 15-member council issued a statement agreed by consensus after the chief appealed to the body to use all tools at its disposal to suppress threats from Afghanistan. Guterres also expressed concern that the U.S. ambassadors, about the future of Afghan women and girls, as he highlighted the need to protect civilians and allow humanitarian access. Important point with this, he was talking about suppressing and making sure there's no global terror threat. He does not appear to be mentioning the Taliban by name, which could mean the UN is looking to assist in the quote-unquote rebuilding of Afghanistan with the Taliban now in charge. The United States under the Biden administration also appears to be doing this as well, which means that the authority of the Taliban is not really being questioned right now. Now, under this current situation, if the Taliban, which was the target of the entire war on terror there, mostly, you can say Al-Qaeda in some regards, but mostly the Taliban, if the Taliban, the main fighting force, is the government, who would anybody fight against? Other than, well, people trying to fight against the Taliban, right? Because what happens when, it's an old saying, right? That, basically, when the government becomes corrupt, it's criminals. When the government becomes corrupt, it's usually good people who are called criminals. When the criminals run the country, the good people are called criminals. The law flips upside down. If you have the terrorists in charge, the anti-terrorists become the terrorists. You understand? And what does that mean then if the United Nations steps in and they want to suppress any quote-unquote terrorists, and they're not mentioning that the Taliban is a terrorist because the terrorists are running the country, who are the terrorists then? The terrorists then become insurgent forces who oppose terrorism. The anti-terrorists become the terrorists, is what's going to happen, very likely. And so if the United Nations, we'll see what they really mean by this. Again, this is based on the idea that they're not really targeting the Taliban, it appears. And they are saying they'll have to see how things go. So maybe this isn't what they're suggesting. But if the CCP steps in to help them, if the U.S. is really not challenging the authority of the Taliban, already the State Department has given statements calling the Taliban really not making it out to be much of a threat. And the Taliban's playing the peaceful game right now. Again, who is the terrorist if the terrorists are the one in charge? The terrorists are the ones who would fight against the ruling regime. And if the ruling regime is siding with the Chinese Communist Party to implement different social controls, seizing firearms, probably implementing different forms of, again, social control, much like the CCP is using, what's going to happen to Afghanistan? Well, again, it's going to be really totalitarian Islamism, meaning the political Islam, with the Chinese characteristics, meaning the CCP is very likely going to implement some of its forms of totalitarian control. And there's some key indicators of this that I want to go into. Now, briefly on this, the Taliban announces amnesty and is saying women can work and go to university. And again, that was one of the big things the United Nations said that needs to be done. They said that, again, they have to make sure that there's no abuses of women there. The Taliban spokesperson also said no groups will be allowed to use Afghanistan for terrorist attacks. You hear that? So the Taliban now is positioning itself as an anti-terror force. See where the pattern's going here? So the United Nations is talking about fighting terror, making sure that nothing happens with terrorism. The Taliban is saying they're going to make sure no groups will be allowed to use Afghanistan for terror attacks. And they're also addressing the concerns that women are going to be abused, saying that nothing's going to happen with that. They're saying women can work and go to university. What's happening, folks? They're framing the people who would oppose the Taliban as the terror threats. And they're establishing themselves as a legitimate government. This is, again, what happens when terrorists run the country. But those who oppose terrorism become the terrorists. Real briefly on this, according to the story here from the Taliban spokesperson saying no groups will be allowed to use Afghanistan for terror attacks, let's briefly mention what they're saying here. It says one of the Taliban's main officials, spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid, claimed in a press conference Tuesday that no groups will be allowed to use Afghanistan's territory to launch attacks against any nation. Afghanistan's territory will also not be used as a training grounds for terrorist groups that can then launch attacks, he said. And he said, we don't want any internal or external enemies. And this is him, Mujahid, who for years has remained a shadow figure and made no public appearances, saying in his first press conference and public appearance. Again, folks, the terrorists are running the country, Afghanistan. And if the terrorists run the country, who then is designated a terrorist? Anybody who would challenge the power of the terrorists becomes the terrorist. And the CCP is, again, going to be engaging with them, the United Nations, saying they're going to make sure that no terrorism exists in the country, meaning the Taliban is very likely going to be stabilized as the official government of Afghanistan, a terror force, while, again, launching with the CCP alongside it these different social control programs, which they're already poised to start building. Now, on this note, this is a very important point that nobody's mentioning. It's according to Epoch Times. It says, new Xinjiang military appointment underscores fragility of Central Asian security. It's going to what this means. All right, hear this out, right? It says the Chinese Communist Party's appointment of a new top military commander for the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, also called East Turkestan, where again you have the persecuted Muslim Uyghurs. Again, the CCP carrying out an ethnic genocide of people who are Muslim in China, right? They appointed this individual to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and could result in further unrest along the nation's westernmost border, according to experts. The CCP appointed Lieutenant General Wang Haijiang as a new military commander for Xinjiang, and the timing of this is important, which borders, again, the volatile regions of Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. Now, a bit further into the story, it says this. Chen, the current party chief in Xinjiang, previously served as the CCP's regional head in Tibet. He was the architect of numerous repressive policies, including the infamous double-linked household management system in Tibet and the so-called Uyghur re-education camps, Gladly said. In other words, this is the guy who runs the Muslim gulags in China. This is the guy who set up the Muslim gulags. Now, what happens when this individual is put in charge of Xinjiang, the place where the CCP is basically pioneering a lot of social control systems for countries much like Afghanistan? Well, they're putting into place this system for repressive policies to fight against what they deem as terrorism. Now, again, this is a country bordering Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And what else are they dealing with? Now, in Pakistan, one of the things the CCP has done is made its Belt and Road Initiative straight through one of the contested areas, Balochistan, where you have terror groups, that are opposed to the Pakistani government launching attacks on the Chinese Communist Party's resources, its supply lines basically going through that area. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to fight them directly, and so it's asking the Pakistani government to step in and fight them, meaning the CCP is risking getting involved in a terror war. But because they're aligned with the people who are actually running the terror networks, Iran, Pakistani regime, and now the Taliban, who are the terrorists, right? Same thing in Tajikistan. You have people of terror groups attacking their supply lines. In other words, you have kind of you have a system basically where the main terror forces, the large-scale ones, the ones that have state backing, are aligned with the Chinese Communist Party. The more grassroots, localized terror threats are the ones opposing what the CCP is doing. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is launching genocide against Muslims right now. They're launching actual genocide, designated as such by the US and other countries, against Muslim Uyghurs. Do these countries actually care about that? No, they do not. The Pakistan government doesn't care. The Iranian government doesn't care. Many of these countries' leaders don't care, because this is not actually about persecution of Muslims. This is not really about holy war. This is about, again, not wars against the Muslim believers. This is a system of state control under very, radicalized organizations looking to gain power and establish the control over these regions using religion as a tool to do so. The CCP is assisting them in doing that. Now, Afghanistan is very likely now going to become a pet project of the Chinese Communist Party, both to stabilize Afghanistan under this new China model, probably replicating, very likely in my estimates, what they're doing very likely replicating what they're doing in Xinjiang, also called East Turkestan. Now they have this individual placed there. If this individual is placed there, they can use this as the model to export to Afghanistan, meaning the Taliban is going to look like a very big force coming in and saying, look at the peace and prosperity and stability we brought to this region. We have now suppressed all the terror threats. That's the key word here. They're going to be calling the groups that would oppose their power terror threats. I can almost guarantee it. It's already starting. And the CCP is going to be assisting them in doing so. And as the CCP establishes stability in the region of this totalitarian system, they're going to be using this as the diplomatic tool to say, look what we did when the US and other countries could not do it. That's where it's heading with this. All right, folks, that said, I'm going to go into some questions now. So if you have questions, leave them in the chat. Before we jump into that, though, I mentioned a few times we now have Epoch TV, EpochTVcom. And if you want to support Crossroads, please go to Epoch TV, EpochTVcom/Crossroads. You find some great programs there. We have a lot of exclusive content there. Our communism series, anti-communism series is there. We have other special features and all others in the work as well. Keep you updated on it, as well as a whole lot of other shows and new content lined up. Some great stuff there. Check it out if you haven't already. If you don't have an account, all you need for a free trial is your email address. So check it out, folks, EpochTV.com. We'll show you a quick trailer we're working on now.
I wanted to take conspiracy theory and turn it into conspiracy fact.
People kind of suspect this is happening, that certain keywords trigger things within the algorithm. That is actually happening then?
That's actually happening. They actually have that. They show like a graph, a tree, and they say, actually, this forms a super story that spans 8 days. So with the Trump-Comey thing, they're able to keep the stories boosted all the way at the top because the algorithm was able to fold a news story into the stories that were preceding it in the last 5 days.
Using the label of fake news in order to target legitimate reporting that they just didn't agree with politically.
They allowed the mainstream media to structure their stories so that they could remain at the top of their search index, of their news index.
I see.
And I found the real censorship engine. I knew immediately from the name that this was it. And the name of it was...
All right, folks. Check out that interview. That's Google whistleblower Zach Voorhey. Again, he's the guy with Project Veritas who worked at Google, saw a lot of their internal documents and what they were doing, stepped forward as a whistleblower, and the rest is history. You'll find a lot of very interesting information in that interview talking about the kinds of programs that Google is actually running, some of which they framed around, trying to go after Trump and censor Trump. If you're wondering why you don't see certain news articles coming up on Google, if you're wondering why a lot of information seems to be very difficult to find, well, check out that interview. You'll find out why. All right, folks, that says jump into some questions for the night. First is from California Gal. He said, why did President Biden withdraw from Afghanistan the way he did? What could he have done better to help save lives and keep the Taliban from taking over? Well, remember that Trump originally was saying he wanted to end the war in Afghanistan. He wanted U.S. troops to pull out. But he had stipulated that, he was going to do it, and then he decided, no, we can't let down our veterans. We didn't go there for no reason. We need to make sure we stabilize the country. Now, one of the big problems that came up is that as the Taliban began their takeover, the Afghan forces, the ones we spent more than a decade training, fled the country. Many of them, well, not all of them, but a lot of them fled. One of the big things they've mentioned is that they were capable of fighting against the Taliban when they had U.S. assistance, especially when it came to air support. The United States was assisting them in fighting against the Taliban through things like air support, artillery, and so on. The U.S. ended that, again, under the Biden administration. Their ability to actually fight the Taliban was severely crippled because of that. Now, the Taliban was getting support from who knows who. We know the CCP has backed them to some extent, getting support from who knows who. But the United States was backing the forces fighting back against them. When the U.S. cut that support, they felt unable to fight, to continue the fight against the Taliban. And as U.S. forces were leaving, they felt, again, that they maybe didn't have a chance of fighting against them. And so they fled the country as well, or fled the area as well. We'll see where it goes with those individuals. But basically, we abandoned them is what it comes down to. We abandoned the forces we spent all these years training, and this is what happened. You're asking why did Biden withdraw from Afghanistan the way he did? Well, it was, I don't know. I mean, I don't know his thinking with it. We can say that it was done very rapidly and without a lot of calculation in terms of what would happen. Maybe they did calculate what would happen. Again, the CCP was meeting with Taliban representatives last month before all this. And so they were already anticipating very likely the strategy for takeover and very likely calculating how they could align themselves with China. This is my assessment. Very likely trying to look at how they could align themselves with China to take over, establish legitimacy, and basically avoid an international crisis. The United Nations can step in, basically not do anything, and then relatively back them. Because the CCP controls a lot of the United Nations. If the Taliban has the support of the CCP, it means they have the support of the United Nations to a large extent. If they have the support of the CCP and they can go in and stabilize things, quote unquote, by basically creating a country run by terrorists, which is exactly what's happening, and some of the biggest human rights abusers in the world when it comes to the CCP's involvement with it, while they can establish new controls, again, using the Chinese Communist Party's model of social control, and declare that anybody who opposes them is a terrorist. In other words, if you are simply somebody who opposes terrorism, you are now a terrorist. That's how it's going to be. Another question here is from Russ Gregstan. He said, I've read accounts of thousands of American citizens trapped in Kabul, among them 200 plus Christian missionaries slated for beheading tomorrow morning. Thoughts? Well, folks, what is the biggest persecution against Christians taking place right now? Actually, a lot happening in different parts of the Arab world where Christians are being, there's an actual designated genocide in Iraq and other parts of that region. Actual designated genocide that gets almost no coverage whatsoever in the media of Christians. You do have genocides happening in that region and nobody even talks about it. In fact, I'd say most of the mainstream media won't touch it. What is the other big country persecuting Christians? The Chinese Communist Party. You have about 100 million Christians in China, estimated. And yes, the CCP persecutes them. How do they do it? They call them extremists. They call them religious extremists. And so the Taliban can replicate now the China model. The China model is one where you call your adversaries extremists. And you use that label to go and kill them. You use that label to throw them in gulags. You use that label to make re-education through labor programs, slave camps. That's what the CCP is doing with this. You can expect the Taliban, if they're working with the CCP, to use the same model. Because the Taliban now is talking about stability. They no longer need upheaval. They no longer need revolution. they're the ones in charge. They no longer need the population to have guns. People no longer need to be able to defend themselves because they've brought stability. It's the narrative they're using. The Taliban, the terrorists, are the ones in charge now. So who are the terrorists? Anybody who would oppose their terrorist rule are now terrorists. And so, yes, Christians now can be called extremists. They can call them the religious extremists, and they can throw them in camps and declare to the media and declare to the world, the Taliban government, the official government of Afghanistan, is helping fight the terror threat. We're helping stabilize the country. We're making sure there's no forces that would want to disunite our newly united country and bring back the days of chaos. The Chinese Communist Party does the exact same thing using the exact same narratives. Expect the Taliban to do the same as it does this stuff. Expect the same type of persecutions you would, well, anticipate to happen in that region. Beheadings of Christian missionaries, beheadings of anybody who would oppose their regime, persecution of individuals who oppose their rule under the narrative of fighting extremism. Again, they're replicating very likely the China model. That's the China model. Next question's from G. Stanfill. And again, that's with UN, the Chinese Communist Party having heavy influence over the UN. And if the UN isn't going to, well, state its opposition to the Taliban, again, their use of the label terrorist is going to be very different from what we normally think of a terrorist. The definition of terrorist now is going to become a political tool to go after opposition and groups they just want to target. Next question is from G. Stanfield. He said, question, where over the last 20 years did the Taliban get all their ammunition and weapons? That's a good question. Now, a lot of people point to, well, maybe they got them from Soviet era, Soviet technology. Again, the Soviets had trained a lot of individuals there. The Taliban at the time, the Mujahideen, were the ones fighting them. Osama bin Laden was one of the Mujahideen leaders, acting heavy with CIA support and U.S. support. If you want to watch an interesting movie on this, go watch Rambo 3, which is actually dedicated to the brave, Mujahideen fighting against the Red Threat. Actually, I have a Muslim friend who was telling me a lot of them are actually very anti-communist. I assume they just don't understand that the CCP is a communist system still. Basically, they got a lot of weapons from, well, their days of Soviet control, where the Soviets were arming the military there and arming their own groups and training them. Also, the Mujahideen, who were getting U.S. weapons and U.S. training and anti-air missiles to fight against the Soviet gunships and so on. And also, folks, you could expect a lot of guns coming across the Pakistan border, because again, one of the major transits for a lot of the fighters was through the whole Pakistan border region, which the U.S. fighting force couldn't cross. And who has a lot of influence in Pakistan? The Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party aligned also closely with the Iranian regime, the biggest state sponsor of terrorism, both of which had it deeply in their interest to keep the United States busy in Afghanistan. So a lot of very likely they were getting armed from that side of the border, let's put it that way, and very likely through close international friends who would want to keep the war going, let's put it that way. Next question here is from Solar Power 4. He said, is there any discussion about moving the Muslim refugees to another Muslim country that we had agreements with rather than the U.S.? That does not seem to be the case. It does seem to be that they're going to be moving them into the United States very heavily. We'll have to see, though, because one of the issues you have as well is that the war in Afghanistan wasn't just being fought by the United States. You had allied forces, right? This whole coalition, international coalition, assisting the United States in the war on terror. You're going to have a lot of other countries in Europe feeling, maybe saying that they're guilty and saying we need to take refugees as well. So you could expect maybe France and Germany and other countries, well, I mean, not France, or the Freedom Fries issue. You could expect some of these other countries to be taking in Afghan refugees. Well, the French were there too, right? You can expect some of these other countries to take in refugees as well, I would say. Currently, the U.S. is positioning itself to take most of them, if not all of them. We'll have to see how it develops. In terms of other countries being willing to take refugees, we'll have to see. You do have Saudi Arabia positioned through Trump-era policies to become kind of one of the regional global leaders, especially when it comes to fighting against terrorism. The problem is that's a different system than the China-led one, right? And this goes back pretty far. You go back to the Soviet Union and the Cold War. Basically, Iran was the pet project of the Soviet Union. The Iranian Revolution was pet project of the Soviet Revolution. You had Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Front, the PLA, the PLF, as one of the major terror groups fighting in that region, heavily controlled by the Soviets at that time, basically running a lot of the terror operations. These were not just grassroots terror movements; they were working heavily with the Soviet Union at the time. The terror side of that, Iran, so on, Yasser Arafat, those guys, and actually the Afghan forces being trained by the Soviets while the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen, which became, again, Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda and all this stuff. It's a bit of a knot, right? The main force the U.S. was backing was in Saudi Arabia. That's kind of the pet project of the United States. Now, the U.S. agreements that were made to stabilize the region under Trump was a regional agreement that they made with Saudi Arabia positioning them to become one of the major forces to prevent terror in the region. And again, this agreement they made with Israel to stop basically a lot of this whole conflict that's been going on for 1,000+ years, right? Now, where is it with this? If Afghanistan falls under the Chinese system, that's Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and a few other countries as well, but those are the main ones. Meaning that Afghanistan is going to be positioned more with Iran than with Saudi Arabia, meaning that I'll have to see if other countries in the Arab region want to work with them still. We'll have to see how Afghanistan positions itself with this. But very likely they're positioning themselves currently to align with the CCP system. Another question here is from Serena L. You said, question, Jack Posobiec mentioned China's forgotten occupation. Do you know and can you tell us about that? I'm actually not familiar with China's forgotten occupation. I don't know what the reference is here. Is he talking about their occupation in Afghanistan? Well, on that note, assuming that's what he's discussing, the Chinese Communist Party has, for a long time, had troop presence in Afghanistan. Mainly, though, they're just protecting the CCP's mining operations there. While U.S. and allied forces were fighting against terror in the region, the CCP was making money out of the region. And the CCP, in other words, has positioned itself when it comes to business, when it comes to big business and corrupt business, and also making diplomatic ties with these groups to make sure that they don't attack their networks. They've been busy at work playing a very different game in Afghanistan, which has positioned them very well right now to work closely with the Taliban, the group everybody else was fighting, and basically make them the power in the country. Meaning, the Chinese Communist Party basically backstabbed the U.S. and allied forces in Afghanistan by aligning itself with the group that everybody else was fighting, meaning very likely this whole time it was playing the opposite role. The Chinese Communist Party was on the side of the bad guys this whole time, pretending like they were on the side of the good guys, essentially. That's what's happened. Another question here is from Tumblr. He said, Josh, I don't think this video is live on Epoch TV. We'll check on that. Sometimes the video goes live on Epoch TV just a bit after YouTube, just because of the way the system works. But we do have live Q&A there as well. I remember we had some hiccups early on. It's working smoothly now. So again, you can also watch these lives on Epoch TV, EpochTVcom, /Crossroads. And so, again, if we ever go down here, if they ever give us the grand prize, the journalism award of YouTube, and just delete the channel, you can still find us in Epoch TV. So it's our contingency plan, but we do have it there in the meantime. So you want to support us there, please check it out. All right, folks, that said, I want to go into a few more stories talking about these mask mandates and what's happening with this right now across the U.S., because there's a lot to go into with this. Now, big thing here, if you have kids and your kids or nephews or nieces or anything like that, or grandkids, and they're going to school, public school, and they're being forced to wear masks, well, guess what, folks? The NIH director has now admitted the school mask mandates are not based on data. This is not based on data on COVID-19's effect on children. Let's go into it. It says here, National Institutes of Health NIH Director Francis Collins on Tuesday indicated that the push to make America's youngest students wear masks at school is more due to concerns over potential school closures, rather than based on data of COVID-19's impact on children's health. In other words, this isn't based on real data about a threat to children's health. This is them being concerned about potential school closures. It says here, Collins weighed in on the debate over mask requirements in American schools during an interview with the Hugh Hewitt Show. When asked by host Hugh Hewitt about the recent federal recommendations that children in kindergarten through third grade should wear masks, Collins said that although young children getting COVID-19 is rare, which he acknowledged, unmasked students could cause COVID-19 outbreaks at schools, forcing their peers to return to remote learning. Now, I won't go over the whole thing. There was some back and forth between them. One of the big things that that Hewitt mentioned was he said may. In other words, he said that this isn't really a definite thing. He said it may cause this. And Collins, when questioned on that, replied, I wish we had that data. That's the key word there. They don't have that data, folks. The data that would necessitate these programs they have launched, they don't actually have, which brings to the question of why they're doing it. He said, I wish we had that data, but Hugh, I don't think you're hearing me. It's just not about that. It's not about the data, folks. It's about concerns that if kids get it, well, they're going to have to shut down the schools. They have to lock down the schools again. That's what it's really about. Not about a serious threat to kids' health. Now, briefly, I'll go over a few things just briefly. New York City is starting to require proof of COVID-19 vaccination and photo ID at restaurants and gyms. This is going to bring up a lot of very interesting arguments. Because remember, folks, we were talking about the election audits and the changes to election laws happening in different parts of the country. Like, for example, Texas and Georgia and these other states that are looking to strengthen election systems. Remember how the Department of Justice was trying to stop that from happening? The Department of Justice is filing lawsuits in at least one case, stating that it's basically a violation of voter rights because by requiring things like ID, the need to have an ID to go and vote, that it's racist. Now, folks, if it's racist to have an ID to go and vote, is it racist to have an ID to go to a restaurant or a gym? Or is it racist to have an ID to go to your local supermarket, which is they're actually trying to implement in Los Angeles right now? Is that racist? Well, you tell me. One of the interesting things is that actually in terms of racial groups, they're saying that Black Americans have one of the lowest rates of people wanting to get the vaccine. So this actually is a race issue. It's becoming a race issue. If a lot of Black Americans choose to not get vaccinated, and a lot of Americans, I think, are making that choice. In New York, it's one of the larger groups who don't want to get vaccinated. If Black Americans don't want to get vaccinated, does this then become a race issue? And if the Department of Justice is making lawsuits against local states trying to put in voter ID laws and saying that voter ID laws are racist because they're claiming that minorities minorities aren't able to get IDs allegedly to go and vote. They're suggesting that maybe they're less capable of this. How does that relate to them having vaccine passports that require an ID to go to your local gym, go to a restaurant, maybe even your local supermarket, or use some basic services, it seems? Is that then racist? This is going to be one of the big, interesting discussions we're going to start having as a country. This is going to be one of the biggest arguments this is going to bring up. Because you just had for a very long time all these different talking heads all across the mainstream media, all these different talking heads in different organizations, political groups, all these different talking heads in politics claiming this. And so all these different talking heads, media, big government, big tech, all these talk shows and so on, making that claim that voter ID is racist. Well, those same people now say that vaccine ID is racist. Watch, folks. Going to be a very interesting discussion to have, especially as the Department of Justice tries making lawsuits and using lawsuits using that claim, because this is the double narrative that's being pushed, a contradiction within their narratives that's being pushed. And very likely one of the big places you're going to see a lot of legal arguments and media arguments coming up as we go forward into this. Because actually, unlike with voter ID, very likely, because you can show just about any type of ID, you actually do have a lot of people, racial disparities in terms of people wanting to get vaccinated. At the same time now, Giuliani's son and candidate, mayoral candidate, Silva, again, remember the, what do they call themselves? The Guardian Angels, these guys who wear the red berets and go on subways and stuff. They're speaking as hundreds have gathered to protest vaccine mandates in New York City because a lot of businesses are saying they're not going to be able to survive with these vaccine mandates. If they have to turn away business, if you're a restaurant owner and you have to turn away business because someone doesn't want to get vaccinated, or even if they have gotten vaccinated and don't want to really even support the idea of vaccine mandates, well, they're going to lose business and possibly go out of business. A lot of them are not happy about it. And at the same time in France, you have very similar things happen. You have mass protests erupting across France and other parts of Europe and the world as well, but mainly in France, some of the biggest ones taking place as well. So you already have a lot of protests going on. Same time with this, Washington State University, this is a university, not a state. Washington State University is going to be ending personal and philosophical exemptions for COVID-19 vaccines. Now, you actually in a lot of places in the United States, you actually can get exempt from vaccinations if it's your religion. A lot of Hasidic Jews, for example, don't get vaccinated. That was one of the big issues you had in New York City, where Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio were going after the Hasidic Jewish community, claiming they were responsible for spreading measles or whatever it was. And all the mainstream media were siding with the big government on that, while trying to claim that everybody else is Nazis and anti-Semites and stuff like this. They were using that and targeting the Hasidic Jewish community, claiming that they had to get vaccines for their kids because they chose not to do so before that. That actually made it so they overturned in New York City the ability of people having religious exemption, kids, not adults, of having religious exemption from vaccines for public schools. And so if you had a kid in public school, they were no longer able to say, we don't want to get vaccinated because it's against our religion. They changed that. Now, other parts of the U.S. have not made that change just yet, but now that it's spreading a bit, you now have Washington State University ending personal and philosophical exemptions. It's not clear whether that would include religious exemptions as well. And in Hawaii, the lieutenant governor there is warning that unvaccinated people may prompt a new lockdown. Now, they're not talking about national lockdowns just yet, but now you have some talk of local lockdowns. Hawaii now discussing it. We'll see where it goes with this. All right, folks, it's getting a bit late. Let's see here. I'll talk real briefly about one thing. I won't go too deep into it because this could be a whole episode in itself. Oh, by the way, the drink tonight is good old-fashioned black tea with honey. Nice classic for you all. Now, in China right now, there's some very strange developments taking place. The Chinese Communist Party is moving to indoctrinate school children with what they call Xi Jinping thought. It's also called Shiism, right? I won't go over this whole story, but just briefly. It says here, Chinese leader Xi Jinping wants to instill loyalty in all Chinese citizens, beginning with elementary school students. As students across the country return from summer break in September, they'll find one more course on their curriculum, which is called Xi Jinping Thought. The new drive for ideological control will run from grade school through college, and it has a mandatory textbook as well called Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics in the New Era. And it's going to have 5 editions. Now, it's going to be taught in grades 3, 5, 8, and 10 on a weekly basis. And the book aims to, quote, gradually shape student support for the party leaders and the socialist system, according to the Ministry of Education. Now, anybody who claims that China is not socialist, they call themselves socialists. They're run by the Communist Party of China. And again, they're putting in Xi Jinping thought and talking about socialism with Chinese characteristics. They're socialist folks. Now, this move, coupled with an escalating clampdown on Western materials and classrooms, points to the regime's desire to strengthen ideological control. starting by shaping the worldview of the youngest parts of the generations. Now, I won't go too deep into this, but briefly on this as well. China is also terminating 286 Sino-foreign college programs, including those at 30 U.S. universities. Also part of a broader push they're making right now to reform Chinese Communist Party education. I won't go too deep into this, but the CCP, as we speak right now, is launching this internal re-education program for the Chinese people. This internal re-education program, they're launching inside the party itself a new purge, modeled after Mao Zedong's program for establishing a system to become chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, basically becoming the absolute leader of the CCP. Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party, is not absolute leader. He's not chairman. There are actually other centers of power which he's fighting against. There's a lot of internal fighting. At the same time, they're launching a new program, mixed model economy, they're calling it. Chinese state capitalism, they also call it, meaning socialism, where the CCP is gaining partial ownership over all businesses in the country. They're now restricting the Chinese people's ability to get passports, meaning that Chinese people can no longer leave the country in a lot of cases. They're putting into place a new digital currency, the digital yuan, run by the main central bank in China, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, through which they can control all purchases. And they're establishing new forms of social control, and they're trying right now, as we speak, to export all of this. This is the CCP in its own views, basically coming to the stage where they view the U.S. on the decline, and they believe the China model is the model for the world, and they're moving very rapidly and very aggressively to spread it. Now, their ability with this is challenged because there's a lot of internal instability within the Chinese Communist Party itself. And frankly, folks, these programs, these other ones, suggest that even among the Chinese people, maybe the CCP doesn't have the amount of support it likes the world to think it has. Now, a lot we can go in on this. Also, a lot of international opposition to the Chinese Communist Party, but also a huge propaganda push right now. Afghanistan very likely going to become the pet project of this, and we'll see how that goes, as you do have some actual local threats against that very likely could spring up. But folks, there's no shortage of topics to go into going forward, and again, I'll be keeping you all updated on this. Now, again, one of the interesting things of 2021 and 2020 and very likely 2022 is there's no shortage of big stories to talk about, right? And folks, again, I'll be keeping you updated on this. As always, appreciate all of you. Always enjoy doing these. I'll be doing the live Q&As like this every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So again, be sure to tune in this coming Thursday. A lot to talk about. Also, if you haven't yet, be sure to go to Epoch TV, EpochTVcom. Check out some of the special features we have there. This new History of Communism series I'm putting together. Second episode coming out very soon. First episode already out. New episode is going to talk about the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror as it relates to the origins of communism. Also, folks, we have a lot of other documentaries there. You can check out the one we just did, America Rewritten, talking about what's happening in the U.S. and the attacks on the Constitution. As said, folks, as always, appreciate all of you. As always, stay informed, stay free. Thank you. Communism is a belief in the destruction of belief. It destroys religion wherever it goes. So who is the unholy father of communism? François-Noël Gracchus-Babeuf. The French Revolution would be remembered for its unjust bloodshed, killing over 300,000 people. It was a period known as the Reign of Terror.